small business owner. So you wish to be at one with your enterprise. First, you must attain inner peace of small business insurance. This is Zensurance.
If you're self-employed, an entrepreneur, or a contractor, peace of mind is just a click away at Zensurance.com, Canada's leading source for small business insurance. It's quick, easy, and affordable. Get an instant price today at Zensurance.com.
Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
Canada, we have a problem. I hate to say it, but we do. It's a serious problem. It's been going on for many years. And it's time that we address it. You know, they say the first step to getting better is admitting you have a problem. Well, it's time we admit that we have this problem. Here's the deal. Our allies are not happy with us. We're being accused of being freeloaders. We're being accused of not paying our fair share, not living up to our end of the bargain. It all has to do with NATO. As you may know, Canada is a member of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Membership to that military alliance doesn't come for free. It has certain conditions. One of them is how much member countries spend each year on their defense budgets. The official NATO target is 2% of national GDP. Canada has not met that target in decades. Under successive governments, both conservative and liberal governments, defense spending has been neglected. It has atrophied. The military has suffered as a result. Today, global security is an open-ended question. We have war in Europe. We have war in the Middle East. Chinese aggression toward Taiwan. Adding to the uncertain geopolitical mix, President Donald Trump will return to the White House and take over U.S. foreign policy again in January. A few months ago on the campaign trail, Trump was saying stuff like this.
They all owed money, and they wouldn't pay it. I came in, I made a speech, and I said, you got to pay up. They asked me that question. One of the presidents of a big country stood up and said, well, sir, if we don't pay and we're attacked by Russia, will you protect us? I said, you didn't pay? You're delinquent? He said, yes, let's say that happened. No, I would not protect you. In fact, I would encourage them to do whatever the hell they want. You got to pay. You got to pay your bills.
That's the soon-to-be leader of the free world and Canada's closest ally. So is it time for Canada to pay up? Are we a NATO freeloader? Is it even possible for the Department of National Defense to procure enough stuff for the military to meet Canada's defense spending target? The Trudeau government has a plan to reach 2%, but not until 2032. Is that good enough? Let's get into it. I'm David Smith, and this is The Big Story. Richard Shimooka is a Canadian defense policy expert. He is a senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute and formerly a fellow at the Defense Management Studies program at Queen's University, as well as a research fellow at the Conference of Defense Associations Institute. Hi, Richard. Thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
So I'd actually like to start by looking backwards, if we can. Here we are in the year 2024. Our NATO allies, the U.S. and Donald Trump in particular, are putting pressure on Canada to increase our defense spending and meet this 2% NATO target. Can you give us some context here, please? What is the 2% target, and how has Canada done historically at meeting that target?
So the specific 2% target actually were just over 10 years ago at the Wales Summit for NATO members, and it was at the time agreed to that Canada would, and all member states would actually spend approximately 2% of its GDP on defense. This is coming out of Afghanistan and almost 2 decades after, or I should say 2 decades after the end of the Cold War. A lot of countries had sort of put defense as a much lower priority. But in 2014, there was the view that Russia was becoming an increasingly sort of threat to Western Europe and the NATO members. So there was an agreement to basically have a benchmark that all member states would meet in order to sort of bring their militaries up to a sort of an acceptable level to sort of counteract that and deter such a threat to their countries. It's not some sort of magic number, but what I do think is important to realize is that when you hit around 2%, a lot of the sort of budget figures within the defense field sort of align somewhat well, where that you actually start spending enough on what we call operations and also procurement, basically the equipment that we're going to need for later on, and as well as the personnel numbers. So the 2% guideline has been it's not the best measure, but it's an okay one to sort of for countries to actually sustain and meet their military commitments that is commensurate to the size of what they should be spending for providing for adequate defense within the alliance.
Right. And I've seen, lots of commentary on it. It is an arbitrary number. It may be an imperfect target, but nonetheless, it is the target that we have, and it is causing some friction in terms of our relationship now, especially with our American counterparts. So the Trudeau government, to be fair, for its credit, it does have a plan to meet this 2% target. They say they'll be able to do it by 2032. This week, at a defense conference in Halifax, a pair of high-ranking Republican senators said that the Trudeau government's plan is insufficient. Senator James Risch said Trump would laugh out loud if he was presented with the Trudeau government's defense plan. That's what the senator said. So, Richard, I'm sure you've taken a close look at what the government says it's doing to boost defense spending. What do you think of the plan to get there by 2032?
It is somewhat slow. It's one of the serious problems that we've had in defense has been sort of the implementation, especially of capital equipment purchases, which basically is buying new equipment. And it's taken quite a long time to get some pretty critical systems that the Canadian Armed Forces need to sort of undertake their mission. And really, this system really needs some serious reforms. But the reality is that because it takes so long and because of the sequencing of the acquisition capabilities, 2032 is kind of where they're at. Now, if it was, in my view, and I would argue that the government made it a real priority, they could make reforms. They could try to buy them quicker through sort of new pathways to acquire these systems and potentially get deliveries earlier, which would allow them to meet the 2032, meet the 2% guideline in this sort of significantly earlier stage than 2032. But I think that that's really what they've kind of presented as a plan within their fiscal framework is, from their view, the best that they can do or they want to do, given all the sort of other programs and other priorities they have, domestic and whatnot, for their government.
Right. The criticism that has been leveled against Canada is that we're freeloading. We're riding on the coattails of the United States. It's a powerful populist political message. I'll say that for my part. Is there anything to that? How are we doing right now when it comes to our allies on ramping up defense spending in terms of NATO partners?
I don't think it's just the United States. I think all of our NATO allies have pretty well called us out. The Washington summit last spring had Canada continually being highlighted as being one of the most serious laggards in this area. There's also little trust of the government's promise to hit 2032, despite constant sort of statements made by the Minister of National Defense, Bill Blair, or the Prime Minister, given sort of the really slow progress compared to all the other allies on this area. I get the sense that not just the United States, and it's pretty clear that Congress is quite seized and aggravated by the situation, but also our major allies in Europe are basically fed up with this situation and really have been placing a significant amount of political pressure, both publicly and certainly privately, on Canada's lack of sort of momentum and effort in this area.
Okay, Let's start getting into the weeds on this a little bit, because there's a part to this whole conversation that's been missing from the public discourse. The problem on the surface would seem to be a simple one. Canada only spends X number of dollars per year on defense. Our allies want us to spend X number of dollars more per year on the surface. That seems like a pretty simple problem of political priorities. If the government would simply allocate more money to the defense budget, boom, bingo bango, things are solved. That's not really the full picture, is it? The word missing from that debate is procurement. Can the bureaucracy actually procure enough stuff to help us meet this 2% target? Talk to me about Canada's military procurement system. How well is that working for us right now?
So it's had some serious challenges. And while in the past year and a bit here, there has been some sort of movement and some successes, and they've done some effort to reform. And there's actually a defense procurement reform policy or effort that's undergoing that will probably be released in a couple months here. It's still mired in some pretty serious challenges. One of the most significant ones is there's just simply not enough technical staff members available to actually implement a lot of these programs. You have a policy structure that has basically grown up for about 30 to 40 years, depending on how you look at it, that is effectively ensured that there's a lot of incoherence in sort of decision making and a lack of accountability, so that you have basically 6 different groups that are involved in defense procurement. That includes the services, D&D, the department itself. Then you have Treasury Board. You have the Justice Department. Justice. Then you have the Public Works or PSPC. Public Services and Procurement Canada. Yeah. And you have Industry and Science and Economic Development. So what happens is that because all these groups are kind of working in these procurements at the same time, it actually makes it really difficult to push things through. So things that should take a year or two get pushed out further and further because you have to gain consensus, and it really actually affects the ability to actually deliver a lot of these commitments. And that's just one. There's multiple issues that you go through the system. And as a result, you just see delay after delay. And the procurement system has really had challenges, as I said earlier, just delivering the capabilities at a certain cost, at a capability that the Canadian Armed Forces need.
Well, certainly we've all seen the examples of that. They are numerous, too numerous to list. We've got warships, we've got surface combatants, F-35s, even things as simple as sleeping bags. The Army has had trouble procuring sleeping bags in the past year. But I just want to repeat what you said at the start of that, because I did not know this until I actually read a piece that you had written about it. There are 6 different government departments involved in any kind of procurement for the armed forces. That seems like a terrible way to do things. Is there a simpler model out there that we could look at, Richard?
Yeah, certainly. And I think that if you look at the United States and some of our allies, they've really tried to clarify the accountability structures. It's called a single point of accountability model, where you have one person basically in charge of a program, and they have to make a decision that sort of keeps in mind all of these different issues and priorities and whatnot. And currently, we don't have that. I said there's 6 different groups that are involved, that each one somebody from that group can raise their hand and says, hey, based on this, we can't move forward and we need to solve this. And then that's a showstopper, right? Whereas you have a single point of accountability, a single person has to make a judgment call and say, well, I understand this is an issue, but this is, we're going to push through because I don't think it's actually that involved or is that important, and go past that, or find or has a sort of ability to find a resolution on their own rather than letting it sort of halt the entire process. There's different ways of doing that as well. It's not just a single point. You can actually increase the requirements where you have to bring in Treasury Board. Treasury Board is actually one of the more important parties within this program that often stops the progress of a program in order because they want to ensure that the government's getting value for money. There's so many different ways to sort of approach this, but thus far, no government has really made some significant reforms that will address a lot of these issues. And this actually goes to another point, is that I think if we're looking at the big capabilities that we're buying now, the River-class destroyer, the F-35s, our system is okay. Or it's can be made to work with some reforms a little bit better, right? What's really problematic is that we're seeing military capability require a lot of an increasing amount of software-driven capabilities. If we think about cyber warfare or any other sort of cutting-edge system, they all have a sort of software technological component that really requires really quick and agile development of these capabilities. And those systems often are modified continually, like within days or weeks or months, you'll see an update to those systems. And our procurement system is really not well set up for that. Like, especially on what we call embedded systems, which are systems that are on, let's say, an F-35 or an uncrewed aerial vehicle or some sort of really cutting edge capability. Those updates are just not, our system's just not well adapted to sort of maintain those systems. So that's the real area that if we're looking at this sort of single point of cavalry or more flexible ways to undertake defense procurement and defense sustainment as well, we really need new efforts to sort of address and manage those systems.
Right. And I don't want to put words in your mouth or anything, Richard, but it sounds to me like under this deeply flawed procurement system that we have for the military right now, would there be a risk that if you were to allocate a whole bunch of new funding and pump it into that procurement system, is there a risk that there would be almost no point? I don't want to say no point in doing that, but certainly it doesn't seem like that money would be best spent using such a flawed system. Is that what you're saying?
It would be a significant challenge. And I think that you see already D&D often returns $1 billion or $1.5 billion every year back into the treasury because they aren't able to spend it. Which is a real problem because they may well get that money back, but because it's of a certain amount that is budgeted for a certain year, in future years, the buying power of that's eroded because of inflation. So, I mean, with anything, if you were to give somebody $20 a day and to ask them to buy some groceries and you give them $20 in 2 years' time, they're just going to buy less groceries in 2 years' time because the inflation's gone up. And it's the exact same in defense. Actually, defense inflation is worse than regular inflation. So that's a real sort of challenge that defense is facing. Just being able to execute on programs, as it's called, has been problematic. And a lot of the key enablers for that, the workers, the people who can actually do the technical work in order to identify what are the requirements, assess the sort of various competitors and make a decision, or ones who can program and actually put together some of these capabilities in the back end. There's just simply not even close. It may well be an order of magnitude of a shortage than what's actually required.
Okay. Can you give us a sense, broadly, of the state of Canada's military preparedness today? For instance, we do have quite a sizable deployment in Latvia with the NATO response to the war in Ukraine. Outside of that, how many troops could the Canadian Armed Forces deploy at any given time around the world right now if it needed to?
Essentially zero.
Essentially zero. So we have about 2,000 troops in Latvia. Because they're there, they can't deploy the armed forces anywhere else in the world?
We can add a couple here, a couple there to various missions, which we do. UN peacekeeping missions. There's a few dozen here, a few dozen there. Even a recent deployment to, I believe, Jamaica in support of operations in Haiti caused issues. Basically, what has happened in order to meet the deployment to Latvia, the Canadian Armed Forces reoriented its entire training system in order to just sustain one mission. And the 2,200-ish people that have been deployed there is basically the entire extent of the Canadian Armed Forces ability to deploy major capabilities into somewhere outside of the country. There's left some domestically for contingencies that's largely using the reserve force, but even then, the force in Latvia requires significant what's called reserve augmentation in order to ensure that it's able to keep the numbers, and that's been a real challenge. So when the decision was made a few years ago to expand that Latvia mission from I think it was 700 or something like that, or a little more to 2,200 or 2,000 to 2,200, that required the Canadian Forces to really reorient everything that it was doing just to make that one mission set possible.
Thinking about the misfortunes your small business could suffer doesn't seem very zen, but meditate on this for a moment. Thinking leads to preparation. Preparation leads to peace of mind. You could call it Zensurance. Get affordable insurance for as little as $19 per month. Quick and easy, whether you're self-employed, an entrepreneur, a contractor, or small business owner. Zensurance offers the unique coverage you need in a snap. Get an instant price today at Zensurance.com.
Wow. So this provides clarity, I think, to why our allies have been calling us out. I mean, it's not an exaggeration in any way to say Canada's one deployment to assist NATO in its response to the war in Europe is literally stretching to the extreme limit the capabilities of the Canadian Armed Forces as an institution. Is that fair to say?
The Army specifically, and there's some question how long it can sustain this mission. Maybe it will be possible. Maybe like 2 or 3 years down the way, the Army will say, "Look, I mean, we are starting to burn through too many people to sort of support this mission. We're going to have to cut 700 at least just to make it sustainable." The other parts of the armed forces aren't looking that great either. We're trying to undertake a sort of transition from the CF-18 to the F-35. So basically what the Royal Canadian Air Force did was reduce the number of the CF-18s that are really available. They've only updated half of them to a new standard using a new radar. So that's around 30-some. And they have a real pilot and maintainers shortage. And they're trying at the same time to move towards the F-35, but there's issues there as well. So that's another part of the sort of the equation that's sort of facing. And the Navy has, if you look at their surface fleets, most of them are reaching 30 to 40 years old. And when those ships, as these ships are sort of reaching this sort of 40-year age, they're taking a massive amount of maintenance in order to sort of keep going, just because, and if you think about a 40-year-old car, right, it's the same kind of issues. Or a car that goes past 300,000 kilometers, your maintenance bills go up. So one figures that the maintenance on a Halifax-class frigate, which is our main surface combatant, they used to take, when they first came out, they took about 100,000 hours to get back into the water after a deployment, and now it's taking over 1 million. And so our ability to deploy more than 2 is really tough out of, I believe, 12. And then so after that point, maybe 3 out of, if we push it, right? But that's it. So which is not, you're always going to have a cycle there where you're going to have 1 in maintenance, 1 getting ready for deployment, and then 1 out to deployment. So a 3-to-1 is sort of normal, but it's starting to fall down because the amount of work just to keep the fleet going is just so much more than the system can actually handle.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's broaden our view out a little bit more here. Back to the Donald Trump element in this whole equation. Trump is he's not a dedicated believer in NATO, certainly. He's been ambivalent towards NATO, to put it mildly. In the past, he's mused about pulling the U.S. out of NATO or not honoring the treaty if he feels other members like Canada are not paying their fair share. So how will a Trump presidency defense policy look different from the current Biden administration, and what could the impacts be for Canada?
Well, there's always the risk that he said, "Oh, I'll pull out of NATO." At the same time, he calls it one of his greatest triumphs, where he said, "Look, I got all these countries to go to 2%," ignoring that, it was Ukraine that really pushed countries to go past 2%. But he always says, "Look, I made this big." All my pressure made this happen, and he's been happy to sort of identify that as being one of his successes. I think he's going to be skeptical. I think what's probably more problematic for Canada and more sort of the issue that you see is that Congress has pretty universally come out against Canada, and if you talk to congressmen, or if you talk to the staff that are underneath them, they're pretty trenchant in their view that Canada is just not coming close to its requirements, or its upholding its side of sort of defense bargain, and have been pretty outspoken, as we saw just this last weekend at the Health Security Forum. Some pretty influential individuals have just continually lambasted Canada. So I kind of foresee this as being a pretty significant wedge in the future, because Trump administration is just going to listen probably to these individuals, and you can bash Canada over the head on this. We've just seen the announcement of tariffs, potentially 25%, and this may be one of the things that obviously this was about fentanyl in his statements, but I can easily see him pivot and using our lacking defense spending, and especially given that we maintain a common defense posture in the North and our environs seas through NORAD. It's certainly a place where you can easily envision him just using that as even further leverage to get what he wants.
Okay, very interesting. In closing today, I'm going to appoint you defense policy advisor to the Trudeau government, Richard, and you've got a meeting with the defense minister in the morning. What would be your key recommendations to the government at this time?
Pretty simple. I think that if I was to be the prime minister, I would say, look, this has got to be a major issue. And there's no more, we're not going to sort of have a runaround. Like, if you look at our last white paper, it took them over a year and a bit from the original drafting of it to actually getting it out. And it was delayed because there were concerns about how much spending. They didn't want to say they were hitting 2% because it was seen as potentially as too much, or reportedly as, because this was not within their own party's interest, right? Well, now it is. Clearly so, right? So I think the political will was there as the prime minister to say, I want to reform this system. I need to spend more on defense. And I want to make sure that we get the capabilities the Canadian Armed Forces and our allies need to defend our sort of domain. I'm going to reform this system and either appoint Blair or somebody else to spearhead a major reform. A lot of these answers are kind of known. It was actually even in their one of their last campaign planks. They said they would create a defense procurement agency for Canada. So they at one point were thinking about this, and you would think presumably they would have some plan to think about what they want to do on this, right? It just requires the prime minister and his close supporters around him to sort of move forward on something they promised before and do it with some alacrity, because that's just not happened at all. It's been a back burner issue, and clearly now it is a major issue, and they need to to implement and go for on that. Then you can also start announcing some of these programs, starting laying out the groundwork to accelerate some of it while some of these reforms are occurring. that's a easy step to sort of move forward. We're not going to be able to spend all this money by 2025 or maybe even 26. But I think 2027 or 8, you could really see a reasonable, achievable objective for Canada to hit the 2% or even go further. Because the one thing I'll say about this is that 2% is a number, certainly. The reality is that because we've underspent for so long, since we've underspent, we were at one point just below 1%. You have a lot of systems that really need replacement now, as I was talking about with the Halifax class, but even just nuts and bolts things like trucks and in infrastructure. There's a lot of really old infrastructure that's out there. If they were to make this a priority and push it forward, a lot of stuff money could be brought in pretty quickly and to deal with some of these issues, while the longer term, the bigger capabilities that are much more costly and much more complex and much more time, it takes much more time to implement, are pushed through. So it's possible to do this in a couple of years' time. It just really takes real political capital and motivated effort in order to achieve. And I think that's a real possibility. Frankly, I actually think that this might happen to some degree because the Prime Minister is going to need some leverage or something. He'd say, look, this is something I can bargain with. I will increase my defense spending in the next couple of years and give President Trump a potential sort of win here that he would want to achieve.
All right, Richard. Well, let's hope somebody in the defense minister's office is listening to the Big Story podcast today. Some free advice there from our expert on Canada's defense problem. Richard Shimooka, thank you so much again for your time today. It's really great to have you as our guest. Hopefully we can have you back on the program sometime.
Thanks for having me.
Again, that is Richard Shimooka. He's a Canadian defense policy expert, senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, past fellow at the Defense Management Studies program at Queen's University, as well as a research fellow at the Conference of Defense Associations Institute. Well, that's it for The Big Story today. I have been David Smith. Thank you so much for listening. Always great sitting in here on The Big Story podcast. A reminder before I go, if you're not listening to The Big Story on the Seeker app right now, you're missing out. You really are. Radio, podcasts, all in one place. The Seeker app is a fantastic new listening experience that we have for you. We created that just for you, so please use it. It's free. It's a free app. And it's excellent. Seeker, S-E-E-K-R, S-E-E-K-R, Seeker. You get that on the App Store, Google Play, what have you. All right, that's just about enough of me for today. I'm David Smith. Until next time, thank you for listening.